Okay, so I think we're good to go. Just first of all, thank you everyone. This is the first of the lectures in the lecture series, New Frontiers in Development Economics for this year. It was very generously funded by the Kellogg Institute. Thanks so much to Aníbal for the support and for all the staff of the Kellogg Institute that has also been very generous with us in the organization of the event. And also thanks to the economics department, who has also partly funded the stay of the speakers. Today we're very honored by the presence of Professor Mushfiq Mobarak. He's a Jerome Kasoff class of 54 professor of management and economics at Yale University. He is the founder of and the director of the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation at Scale, YRISE, by its acronym. He has published in numerous top science, interdisciplinary, and economics journals, including Science, Nature, Econometrica, American Economic Review, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, EMJ, among others. And he was a recipient of the Carnegie Fellowship in 2017. He's also on the editorial board of the World Bank Economic Review, where I published my first paper.
I did not handle it.
But we're honored to have you here. Thank you so much for honoring us with your presence, and please take it away.
Thank you for that kind introduction. Thank you for being here. So I'm going to do something unusual today relative to my normal research or seminar style, for two reasons. So one is Alejandro Hitor students are being forced to sit through some lectures where I'm talking about what I normally, am more comfortable talking about, like the type of research I do. And so I wanted to make sure that it was interesting for them. So I'm doing something very different. And the second reason is that, we discussed in advance about the Kellogg Institute and what the audience might look like, and that there's an Asia Center or maybe a South Asian Studies Center. So I also wanted to make it interesting to non-economists, because you might have to sit through other economists this semester.
Okay with economists.
All right, I'll try to.
We'll make 100 economists.
I'll try to pretend to not be one for half an hour. So I'm going to I decided to split the difference a little bit, which is for about half an hour. We have 1 hour, right?
1 hour and a half.
Oh,
including
okay, good. 1.5. Okay, great. So for half the time, I will talk about a paper. Like it's an economic history paper, but we use standard econ techniques. So there'll be something for the economists. But then I also agreed, so this year has been unusual for me in that I was forced to become an activist for part of the year. We had to get a dictator out. I'm from Bangladesh. And so that's led to, and actually it turns out a lot of the themes that emerge and the behavior that happened is related to the study I was doing at the same time. I mean, that wasn't the reason for the activism, but it just happened to be correlated. So I'm also happy to talk about what's going on in the country, because especially, those of us, we're not just researchers, we are also interested in policy, we're in the policy school. And there's really interesting, but also uncertain developments in Bangladesh. So it would be, I'm happy to also talk about that. I now have a position with our interim government, and full disclosure, I have no political affiliation anywhere in the US or here or in Bangladesh. But it's an interim government that's non-political, which is why I'm participating. Okay, so let me start with research. So I'm going to talk about a really important historical episode, which is the birth of my country, Bangladesh, right? And how one of the world's deadliest natural disaster in all of human history, how it was related to the creation of the country. Okay. So let me start by giving you some broader motivation, which is this kind of separatist movement, right? Which is what our movement was, Bengalis trying to create a nation for ourselves and separate from Pakistan. Right? So this is not all that uncommon, right? is like, there are some scholarly studies on this, and we created this map based on that scholarship. And they identify at least 400 different separatist movements in the 20th century. Okay? And they're widespread, they're all over the world. What is uncommon is success of separatist movement. Right? That of these 400 movements, maybe about 125 they classify as succeeding in its oh, are you trying to make it full screen? Oh, just Control L should do it. Yeah, there we go.
Yes.
Oh, there
Thank
we
you.
go. Yeah, the other thing I did other than participate in getting a dictator out this year was like do some IT work as well. Yeah, and then what's really exceptional is the creation of new nation states. So that was only about 34 of those 400 cases. And one of those cases was the birth of Bangladesh, which is the 8th most populous nation in the world. We have a population of about 175 million people. And so one way to think about the value of this paper that I'm about to describe is, does it teach us anything about the conditions under which these types of separatist movements actually lead to the creation of new states? Okay. And in this paper, what we'll see is that a big shock, this climate shock, a very deadly hurricane, right? It acted as a focal point that got people united around the cause, right? Because that focal point, that disaster, the fact that disasters happen, of course, is not the fault of any individual, but reactions to the disasters teach you something about leadership, right? So that's what happened here. There was revelation of the quality and interests of leadership, right? And that got people focused on getting independence, okay? And there was already pre-existing grievances that I'll describe to you. I mean, that was long, that formed basically since our independence. Like just last week on February 21st, we celebrated our Day of Remembrance for it's called UN now calls it International Mother Language Day. There was this birth of the language movement, right, which had to do with our desire to speak our own language. And so that was in 1952, right? So there was lots of grievances that were building up. And then in 1970, when the cyclone hit, it sort of crystallized a set of demands, right, that led to this. And what we will do, the new thing, the stories that I'm going to tell, these are actually not, we're not inventing the stories. They're in some form pretty well known, right? Was, the language movement, the fact that the cyclone had an effect, historians have written about it. So the new thing we will bring to the table is to assemble a lot of previously disconnected historical sources, including using a paper published in Nature recently that allows us to interpret satellite data, right? To be able to say something about the variation in the intensity of the cyclone within a country, right? And that allows us to make new statistical claims about whether the cyclone had an effect on the basis of the variation of the intensity of the cyclone. So we basically ask the question, the areas where the cyclone hit more intensely, right? And where relief was not provided, right? Do we see any statistical evidence that those were the areas where the movement for independence was stronger? And did they do anything? Were there any actions that were being taken coming out of those areas in terms of political participation, who they vote for, as well as participation in guerrilla warfare, right? That helps us predict that the independence movement was going to succeed. Okay? So that's kind of what's new here. This statistically analyzing some historical sources that's newly assembled. Okay? Oh, and I should have been clear in the first page. This paper is co-authored with Sultan Mahmoud, who's at the New Economic School in Moscow, right? So as I go through the paper, I hope you will see that there's some value here of a Bangladeshi and a Pakistani writing this paper, based in the United States and in Russia. Although we've learned that United States and Russia have now become allies. And Bangladesh and Pakistan is also much more friendly than they used to be. Okay, so that's so one motivation is about understanding under what conditions separatist movements are most likely to succeed. Okay. A second motivation, which is related to much more contemporary literature on climate change, is that there's a big a set of research results that are emerging that is linking climate events, climate shocks, climate change to conflict. Okay? And there are many papers I could cite, but basically this is a good summary where this is a paper published in Science where it's basically a big meta-analysis of correlation between climate and conflict that has been noticed in many different disciplines, not just in social sciences, but also in the natural sciences. Okay? So they have synthesized like 60 studies that use 45 different conflict data sets. And they show a very consistent pattern, right? Which is that deviations from normal rainfall, normal temperature, like things that we now associate with potential effects of climate change, right? That they are very predictive of increased conflict risk. Okay? But so this is really interesting literature for the current context because one of our worries is we're trying to make predictions about what would happen with climate change in the next century, right? And the claim here is that given the consistency of these empirical patterns, right? One of the domains that we need to worry a lot about is increased conflict risk, right? And the stories, and there are stories to tell there. I don't think the stories, et cetera, have been well documented yet, but stories would be things like, with climate change, there's now emerging water scarcity issues, right? And the water scarcity issues lead to more conflict because people are now fighting over natural resources. Okay? But those are stories. So what we're going to do, what we're adding to that literature here is we're looking at one particular case, right? Where there was a big shock, in that case, a cyclone, right? And in the climate change literature, if you look at the models coming from climate sciences, meteorology, et cetera, one of the claims they're making is that this is going to increase the severity and frequency of natural disasters, right? So we will study one of the most severe natural disasters in human history, right? And how the detailed mechanism by which, fill in all of the theory of change, all of the errors in theory of change, the detailed mechanisms by which that climate event, right, led to actual conflict, a war, and then the birth of a new nation. Okay. And so the main story that we're going to tell is that the cyclone itself is not the cause, but the government's reaction to the cyclone reveals something about that government's priorities, right? And that led to a reaction from the population. And it created a focal point for anger, which actually led to sort of collective action. Okay. Yeah.
During our comments, we still are allowed to interrupt like a conference.
Absolutely. For the first half, yes.
I'm curious about how common it is in external validity that it's sort of like a separatist movement breaking out from a separatist movement, like one generation or something like that. I don't know the history very well, but
okay. I will talk to you about the history. I wouldn't call it one generation before.
Okay.
So this was the period I'm talking about is between early 1950s to 1970. So like an 18-year period, essentially. Okay. So I'm not sure if you should call 18 years a generation. People who were people who were university students in 1952,
yeah,
right? They continued
so it's not even, so it's less than one generation.
Yeah. So basically, we're talking about a set of people. I mean, I shouldn't say a set of people. Of course, there were 20-year-olds, 30 and 40-year-olds in 1952, but people who gave their lives in 1952, right, or saw their friends getting killed, right, they were in their 40s.
I guess what I'm saying is does that make it like external validity question? Is that like a unique thing?
No, I think like birthing a nation takes at least that long. Like I don't think that we should think of that period of time as particularly unusual. So if so for example, South Sudan.
So you think of all as one part of one process?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's not me speaking, that's like historical accounts of like what led to the creation of Bangladesh, right? Any historical account would cover the period of early 1950s along with 1971. Okay, so for some of you, this may be really obvious stuff that you know a lot. I just want to make sure everybody's on the same page. Yeah.
It says, if you took the Bangladesh and you put it on top of the US map, what would it cover? I have no
Wisconsin.
sense of scale here. Wisconsin?
Yeah.
Okay,
Very, very densely populated.
well, I can imagine, that's why yes, yes. It's
Yeah,
like Wisconsin, but-
So imagine in terms of like how to think about that place right now. Now, this is not going to be that important for this
Yeah.
paper, but imagine Wisconsin with half the US population.
And not
I
as
do
big
every
of-
day, actually.
So, but what I want to show in this particular map, which has no population density on it, is that this was a weird country. Right? Countries normally don't look like this, right? And the reason for its creation, like the only thing in common between the two provinces of West Pakistan and East Pakistan was religion and nothing else, right? And we already know how diverse India is, right? Like the language being spoken here, right? Absolutely has no connection, even if you look back about 1,000 years to languages being spoken here, except for the fact that Lakshmi speaks both. That's a sole connection. Okay. So there is a tremendous amount of diversity just going across, right? So therefore, like people living in this region is just fundamentally very different, like ethnically very different, right? And actually that matters, that will matter. So this is, I mean, like stories I grew up with, hearing from my parents. My parents happen to be, I mean, they're Bangladeshi, but they were both students in West Pakistan and they met there. And, important differences here are things like, so basically there's, the reason why the language here is different is that historically there's been a Indo-Aryan population, Indo-European population. And we now know that those language connections, so basically Hindi is probably a bit more similar to German than it is to Tamil. Maybe not just a bit, much more similar to German. So then in terms of, I mean, this is just roughly speaking. So the Indo-European Aryan population is up here, right? That covers West Pakistan, right? And this is a different Dravidian population, right? And we are basically like mulattoes, like we're a mix of we're a mix of the two, right? So we look different, right? I'm an unusual specimen in terms of my height. We're darker skinned and shorter than Punjabis are, right? And this itself was cause for a lot of the friction, right? And these days, I think my Pakistani friends would tell me there's also friction between Punjabis and non-Punjabi Pakistanis, right? The way that Punjabis treat other ethnicities within the state of Pakistan. And only after, I'd heard of.
Have you guys organized a hockey tournament or something? That will get all the aggression out.
Yeah, except that there's no ice. So we play a much more gentlemanly version of hockey.
That's the problem. Gentlemen.
So that meant, partly because of those historical differences, fair skin, taller. The center of power always stayed in West Pakistan. The capital is always in Islamabad, right? And there was lots of, prior to the cyclone, even separate from the language issues, right? There were lots of economic frictions as well, right? One big issue is that at that time, a lot of the foreign exchange earnings were coming off of jute exports, right? So during these wars like Korean War, Vietnam War, etc., a lot of demand for sandbags and jute, right? And Bangladesh actually produced about 80% of the world's jute. East Pakistan produced 80% of the world's jute. So a lot of the foreign exchange was being earned here, but they were being reinvested in West Pakistan, right? So a set of economists who are actually one of, they're now, I would say, okay, that's now a generation, like people who are, if you ever travel with IGC to Bangladesh, you would have met some of them. So there was when they were young economists, so they proposed a 6-point plan, right? of greater autonomy prior to independence. And the 6-point plan involved, for example, asking for a separate currency, right, to break that link. But also greater political autonomy and decentralization. So this was long, these were like long-standing demands that have slowly grown from the 1950s. And I'm talking about the 6-point plan from the second half of the 1960s. Okay? And 1970, maybe I should move to you know what? Yes, the 66 was the 6-point movement. I should talk about this timeline. So the language movement was, I said, 1952, right? So between 1950 and 1970, East Pakistan constituted 65% of the entire population. That matters because that meant 65% of parliament seats were in East Pakistan. So we had the majority of seats if the party were to win, and that's exactly what happened, right? And then even though foreign exchange was coming out of a resource in East Pakistan, it was only allocated about 29% of the government budget, right, for 65% of the population. Right? So there was a lot of economic inequities built in. And between 1954 and 1970, there was no election. Okay, and there was no election because Pakistan already at that time had already developed this habit of handing power to the military. Right? And then the part of history that I'm going to focus most on, that my data is from, is basically between here and here. Okay, a lot happened between November 11th of 1970 to December 16th of 1971. Okay, so by a lot, I mean, so the Bhola Cyclone hits in November 12th of 1970, right? And just coincidentally, right, the first elections in 16 years was scheduled for just a month later, less than a month later. Okay, so this was a very salient event for the elections that immediately followed. Okay? And then the start of our independence movement. So basically, the election is won by the Awami League, which is the separatist party at the time. And this will come back because they were the party in power. So the leader of the Awami League at the time, who we call the father of our nation, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman, his daughter was the prime minister until August 4th of this year. Okay? And then, so anyway, so they're
asking for a separate nation?
No, they just won that. So at this time, what happened, Awami League wins the election, and therefore Awami League should be forming the government, right? But the problem that creates is that West Pakistanis have to accept a Bengali as the prime minister of the nation, right? And that wasn't going to happen, right? So then they hand over power to the military, right? And during this period, there was some guise of negotiations, so some kind of power sharing agreement between the Awami League and the military, but they took Sheikh Mujibur Rahman over, imprisoned him, right? And then the army came and started firing on civilians on March 26th, the evening of March 25th, morning of March 26th, 1971. And that's when we declared independence. Okay? And then, Pakistan has an army, East Pakistan does not. So there's like sort of basically guerrilla warfare going on here until like about 4th December 1971, there's a huge refugee pressure that's get created along the border in West Bengal mostly. And so at that point, the Indian army steps in early December 1971, and then the war is over within like 12 days. So India played an important role. So first by, Soviet Union and India supplying arms to the guerrillas, right? Whereas the United States was actually, so when the war ends, there was a US warship that was still in the Arabian Sea, like it was on its way. So Pakistan was this is a Cold War period. Pakistan was a staunch US ally, right? And what will also become clear about why is it that the leader didn't pay any attention is because he was sort of doing work for Henry Kissinger and President Nixon, bearing messages back and forth to China, to Mao Zedong, right? Yahya Khan, a minister who was just sort of distracted with the US-China Nixon Mao diplomacy. Yeah.
So before the cyclone hit, was there any real chance of Awami League winning the election?
Yes, absolutely. I think it did. Yeah, because I'll show you, actually, I'll show you exactly those results, right? So which is what I can report to you, is greater cyclone intensity. How much did that increase the Awami League vote share, right? But of course, there's no way for me to tell you the baseline or the counterfactual, what would have happened absent the Awami League, but I can at least tell you district by district comparisons, how much it helped, right? So there I would say, like, basically our impact is going to be that greater, like a standard deviation increase in cyclone intensity is taking the Awami League vote share from like 72% to 77% in the East Pakistan province.
So if you look at the 6-point plan, in what way would it allow a country to stay whole? Administrative decentralization, local tax collection, separate currencies, separate military, what is that? And Hawaii, is that part of the United States? It's far away, different ethnicity, different people.
The same currency and the same military.
I'm just addressing the speaker,
Yeah.
asking for clarification.
Yeah. So your question is that is this not just asking for independence?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, it was, yeah, stopping short of creating a new country. It was asking for independence, but it was a reaction to each of those demands was a reaction to how the country was being governed at that point.
Well, that's a separate statement.
Yeah, so okay, so just to be clear, I'm not trying to say that this was a reasonable demand and then something unreasonable happened, right? There was a lot of unreasonable things happening throughout, right? And there was this was a demand in reaction to those unreasonable things. Okay, so the story of how we are able to get this data. So the precursor to what's now the US National Hurricane Center, right? Also, because of the Cold War, the US launched in 1970 this satellite ITOS-1. That was the first satellite. It was remarkable and innovative because it was the first satellite that was put in geosynchronous orbit. So it could constantly send pictures to the ground about weather patterns, as opposed to previous satellites where you'd get a photo and then you'd have to wait for about 24 hours to get another photo of what was going on. And so it was sending infrared visual observations of cloud cover to the National Hurricane Center. And there were receivers available all over Asia and South Asia. So this data was available if people wanted to use it, right? And interestingly, the reason why the US put this satellite into orbit was something related to the topic of this paper, which is that the Department of Defense thought of it as a priority during the Cold War because they thought that the satellite images would help them predict brewing conflicts, right? Because they had already made the conceptual link between natural disasters and sort of conflict reactions. Okay, and very, very luckily for us, so I told you that it gets put into orbit in January, right? The cyclone, the Bhola Cyclone, it's on November 11, 1970. And this satellite, the tape recorder malfunctions and then half the sensory systems fail on November 16, 1970. So we're very lucky that we have those images, like from 5 days before the satellite malfunctioned, okay? And then we use some software to capture the color intensity, which corresponds to more severe radiation impact of the storm. And why that matters is because of this more recent paper published in Nature Atmospheric Sciences, right? Where the scientists find that that there is a correlation between the tropical cyclone intensity being felt somewhere, right? As well as the thickness of the cloud cover and what the satellite help measure. We don't know the thickness of the cloud cover, but what it can measure is radiation, right? And essentially when there's this very thick cloud cover, the radiation doesn't reach the ground, right? And that's what you can measure. And this paper shows, I mean, they validate that the radiation measurement and hurricane intensity are predictably correlated, right? So that allows us to back out at any given point in space, how intense the cyclone must have been. So we are making, to be clear, we're making a very indirect inference here, right? From the radiation measurements about what the cyclone how bad the cyclone must have been. But we are able to cross-validate with some ground truth data, like weather station data. Let me just jump to that. So basically what I have is, the satellite measure the storm intensity, which is coming from these indirect inference from radiation measurements. And then I have a few data points on the ground, right, which could measure wind speed, right? And this is how the two correlate. Okay, so but why use the satellite data then is because we have much more granular information. So with the satellite data, I'm able to classify cyclone intensity for every district in the country. At that point, it was a sub-district. Okay, so then I have this map of, so this is, Bhola is here, right? So basically the hurricane moved in this direction. Okay. And in fact, it's called the Bhola Cyclone because Bhola is a big island, right? But now I've spoken to lots of people who were there, so including a relief worker who was the wife of somebody who worked at ICDDRB in Dhaka. And so she was there organizing relief when the Pakistan government was not, right? And it turns out that the death and destruction was actually much worse, not in Bhola, but in other smaller islands like Monpura. But it's not called the Monpura cyclone just because it's a smaller island. Okay, so imagine, so here's what we're after. So I now have a map of variation in cyclone intensity. I also can generate maps of variation in Army League vote shares, right? And I can do the cross-sectional correlation between the two, controlling for other factors like, say, Hindu share of the population, all the things that should have mattered, right? So that's one of the things we'll do, but that's not the only outcome. So I can look at the Army League vote share, I can look at political participation, like turnout rates, right? But I can also look at, here's the other thing we'll continue doing, is that a few months later is our civil war, what's the War of Independence, okay? So we now know the identities of people who were martyred during the war, right? Who participated in the guerrilla war, and they were. So we also know, we know who they are, we know their birthplaces, right? So then I can also look at whether the cyclone intensity predicts, right, where those martyrs are from, right? So not only are people participating in elections, but also are they taking up arms? And then the final thing I can do, maybe I should continue with the,
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Where are there little islands of white?
No data. That's it. Yeah. Yeah, we just don't have like a radiation measurement consultants. Yeah, but so that's like these ones. Okay, so, and the final thing I'll talk about is that, so that takes us to March to December. And then on December 16, 1971, December 14th. So December 16th is our Independence Day. Actually, Independence Day was in March, so we call it Victory Day. That's the day that the war ends. But so now it's become clear by December 14th, as India has joined the effort, it's become clear that Pakistan is about to surrender. They actually surrendered 2 days later to the Indian Army chiefs. And December 14th, they rounded up intellectuals, right? So teachers, professors, doctors, right? In Dhaka, Chittagong, like in the major cities, and shot them. And the idea, I guess, was to like cripple the new nation. Right? And so we also know the birthplaces of these people, so we can also correlate that with where they're coming from, right? So just to see, I mean, obviously, my story I'm about to tell here is not that Pakistan Army was looking at the cyclone map and deciding what to do. What I'm trying to tell you is that there were certain people who experienced a bad shock and also observed the government's response, right? And they became more likely to participate in politics. They became more likely to take up arms. They became, and those are the names that sort of got elevated as the leadership of the movement, right? Who were then murdered on December 14th. Okay. And the final thing I'll say is that, okay, so I'll show you that map, so not only do we have data on cyclone intensity, from a 1972 World Bank report, I'm also able to code what areas received relief, right? So then I have 3 types of places with less intense cyclone activity, more intense cyclone activity, and places with the more intense cyclone activity that receive relief versus not. Okay, so we'll look at the effect of these three. Like I'm gonna contrast these three types of cases.
Can I ask a
Yeah.
question about Amartya Sen and the cyclone?
With-
So, about Sen's stuff on famines.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Sen makes a big point about how famines are not an absence of food, they're an absence of purchasing power
Of
among
distribution.
certain people, of distribution, okay?
Yeah.
And to what extent is any of that relevant or irrelevant in this context?
Good. Okay, so I'm gonna give you the boring answer first, just for the detail, right?
Okay.
And then I'll give you a much more useful answer. The boring answer is that Amartya Sen was talking about the 1974 Bengal famine, not the cyclone event.
No, I know that I know, yes.
So, but basically, a paper I'll refer you to that I think fits really well here. That is also inspired by Amartya Sen's insight, right?
Okay.
It's a paper by Tim Besley and Robin Burgess, and they use data from India. This is published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics in 2002. Okay? And what they do is look at relief distribution in India, so which is a response to both cyclones and famines, right? And what they try to look at is basically, how do votes respond to relief distribution? And the model they have in mind is that there can be multiple types of leaders. There's like good leaders and they're bad leaders. Like bad leaders are those who don't want to put in that effort, right? But they're opportunistic leaders, like those who only put in effort if it's going to help them, right? So in a model, so it's a signaling model, right? And so what they say is that like sometimes when disasters happen, right, it reveals whether or not you have a good leader versus an opportunistic leader, right? And the reason is that the opportunistic leader only puts in effort and brings a relief if it will help them, right? But if it's really too costly, they don't, right? So when you have big disasters, sometimes you don't see relief and then you learn something about the leader, right? So I think that's inspired by Amartya Sen's work, but it goes a little bit beyond with the signaling story. And I think that fits our story really well. So let me tell you the results and then I think.
Thank you, that's wonderful, thank you.
Okay, so these are pictures, some photographs. The lady I was talking about, now in Massachusetts, she took this photo. So this is, we'll never know the exact number, right? But all reasonable historical accounts put the death toll at somewhere between around 350,000 would be the point estimate, right? So between 300,000 and 500,000 deaths, okay? And most of these deaths actually occurred, or I should say many of the deaths occurred after the cyclone passed, and that has to do with relief distribution. Yeah? So there was inadequate food and medicine distribution post-cyclone, and so look at this. So 300 to 500,000 deaths and only $85 million in damages. Nothing, right? There was not much infrastructure there, so there was not much to damage, right? But it also tells you it actually, from a physical standpoint, this was not that bad a cyclone. In fact, you would categorize this as a Category 4 hurricane, not even Category 5. Okay. So there's a really wonderful book that I would encourage all of you to read by two storytellers, Scott Carney and Jason Milken. The book is called The Vortex. Okay? So they basically take historical sources and create a narrative. Like they make it sort of a popular press, like general interest type of book, where they tell Yahya Khan's story. They tell the story of, in fact, the woman I'm talking about, her friend who she worked with is one of the protagonists of this book. But they also tell the story of like a National Hurricane Center employee in the US who got sent to figure out what the hell went wrong. Yeah. And so that's Neil Frank. Okay. So the first thing that went wrong is that even though it was possible, like because of that satellite, the same satellites where I'm getting my data from, the receivers were there, it was possible for us to know that the cyclone was coming, and nobody bothered to actually send out any warning signal. Nobody bothered to check. Like basically by the time that Neil Frank gets the data, it's like, why the hell did nobody say anything about this? Like it was very clear that a massive event was about to happen. Okay. This is related to the earlier story question about Army League votes, right? So Sheikh Mujib and the Awami League did react in a way that a savvy politician would, right? Which is that they suspended their election campaign. So they were going around campaigning at the time. They suspended the campaign to do relief distribution, partly because Sheikh Mujib was like, okay, this is the way that I get votes, right? So they actually took votes, Awami League votes, and delivered back the rice, etc., and oil, etc.
So in your evaluation, did you consider the India factor, which was as follows, that they had a better early warning system than Bangladesh or East Pakistan had, and that was not conveyed to Pakistan or Dhaka.
Actually, the best early warning system comes
Right,
from
but they had
National Hurricane
better
Center.
than what was in Dhaka or other places. Let me finish.
Yeah.
And you can, I was saying you considered that. The
Okay.
second was that they prevented any flights overflying India to arrive. And so the Pakistani government asked the US Navy and British Navy, and they brought the relief. And that's Bangladesh. That's when Mujib said, oh, we've been rescued by a British command.
Okay.
So that, and then on 30th of January, when still there was devastation and famine, India stopped all oversight flights across it after the hijacking by two suspicious people who brought the oldest Indian airline plane to Lahore and put it on fire. So I think there are other factors that I wondered if you had considered.
Okay, sure. So, so the first part of like warning systems, right? The best warning system comes from this exact same satellite. So it's a question of whether you are, the simple question is whether you're bothering to read those signals in your receivers, right? And then actually relaying an early warning to your population, right? So, and in this particular case, in East Pakistan, there was a big failure, but even in India, there was a failure because the first destruction, the first death that happened from this hurricane is, as I said, it was moving across the Bay of Bengal, right? The first set of deaths that happened was an Indian ship, right? That was caught in the middle of, with a lot of goods that capsized, right? So India failed to warn its own ship as well, right? So that was a collective failure. So I feel like, it wasn't, so based on that history, the fact that India wasn't protecting its own property as well, right? I think it was the failure was just one of nobody bothering to pay attention to this new satellite information. And on the second point about, well, who the culprits are, it's of course possible that there are multiple culprits. I definitely don't want to tell the story that, oh, there's like one easily identifiable problematic actor here. But it is true that regardless of whether India was allowing flights or not, like so people who were physically present, including people who were interviewed for this book, as well as people I've now spoken to, so they had collected relief materials in Dhaka, right? And that simply needed to be transported to the southern part of the country, to the coastal areas, right? And I'll tell you about the two women. Candy Rodi is one of the women who organized the relief distribution. So this is what happened. So they met with the local army officers, the West Pakistani army officers in Dhaka, right? And they said, look, we need support. We just need logistical support. We've already gotten a lot of relief. And so the army officers invited them to the Sheraton Hotel in Dhaka, which still exists, right? And the way they describe it, this is all now written down in multiple books, right? Is the army officers closed the door, put on music, and started dancing, right? Because they thought there were two young American women that they were going to be partying with, right? So there was a lot of, regardless of whether flights were allowed over from West Pakistan or not, right? There was a lot of failure that happened with relief sitting in East Pakistan that's just not being distributed to the coastal areas. Okay, and then, so this is another good example of such a story. So while this type of relief activity is going on, right? And later on in other slides, I have like newspaper cutouts from the New York Times, Time Magazine, etc., that talked about this as one of the deadliest natural disasters in history. The Prime Minister Yahya Khan, who was the leader of the country, just never visited, right? So he comes much later. So he was in Beijing, Peking at the time, right? Ferrying messages between from Kissinger to the Chinese authorities. And so then he stops in Dhaka on a flight back from Peking, right? And then does a helicopter flyby with a helicopter pilot, right? And this is the time when, these other eyewitness accounts are telling us that there were rivers of death and the stench of death was overwhelming, right? So this woman, I'm talking about Candy Rodi, and her husband, who was a doctor, went there, right? And they couldn't handle the stench. You could imagine if there's hundreds of thousands of people dead floating down rivers, what that smells like, okay? So Yahya Khan, it's reported to say, oh, it doesn't look too bad, right? Then he goes back to the airport where, the local relief coordinators are waiting to meet with him. But he takes a flight to Dhaka because the socialite was organizing a party for him. So the Pakistan government's reaction to this, right, was they made it extremely obvious, right? And I remember this is just an anecdote, but my parents telling my father telling me, oh, it just became clear they just didn't care, right? So and this is actually from a Pakistan newspaper, but this is from later on that's Yahya Khan during the war. Okay, and then this the other data sources I was talking about. Let me just actually I was hoping to be finished by now, but but let me just tell you quickly. Okay, so basically we have this report from the World Bank in 1972 that logs where the relief was given, and that allows us to also identify the districts that receive relief. Okay, so that creates those three types of districts that I was talking about. Okay? All right, so the narrative that we're trying to statistically evaluate here is that the cyclone itself didn't create the country. There were pre-existing separatist sentiments, okay? And due to the political inequality and the economic inequality that I described. Okay? But it did create this focal point for political mobilization. It created a focal point of attention so that people could solve that collective action failure, right? And so this is the paper I was talking about earlier, right? That it served to reveal the leader's type, and that helped people understand why the characteristics of leaders matters for their livelihoods. Okay? And whereas the Awami League contrasting response, this is not necessarily that the Awami League was well-intentioned. I don't know anything about their intention, but they did have a much more politically savvy reaction to this by providing a lot of relief, right? And then I've told you about this. So civil war commences in March, and then it ends by 1970. Okay? Okay, so the implications that I can test in the data are, did the cyclone effect, or the intensity of the cyclone, did it have an effect on voting patterns? Okay. And did relief provision in those districts in the south, did it mitigate the effects of the cyclone? Did it affect participation in warfare in 1971? And does it tell, the citizens of the place, or the people who originate from places, from the districts that were hit particularly bad, did they subsequently become more politically active and become military targets, right? So maybe what I might do is, rather than, just in the interest of time, right, I'll just tell you what their main results are, right? And sort of just stop there. And, what the rest of the paper does, like the rest of the slides do, is just think about all the types of robustness checks that we all have. So we do various placebo tests, like looking at those areas, like the satellite images for a day before, right? So they predict voting patterns. We're gonna throw lots of different controls, including like machine learning based double lasso controls, etc., to see if we can knock out these results. And let me also, since I'm not showing you all of that, I'm just going to summarize the results. I'm just going to also tell you like which results are very robust and which results are a little bit weaker, okay? Where you should take it with a grain of salt. Okay? And then we can just talk about, like, we should have a discussion, and I'm, in the discussion phase, I'm happy to talk about all of this, 1970 and 1971, but I'm also happy to talk about 2024. Okay. So the election, right, it favored the Awami League actually everywhere in East Pakistan. Yeah. So on average, their vote share was about 3/4 of the vote, 75%. Yeah. And that's what allowed them to win, because they won the majority of seats. They won all the seats in East Pakistan, which meant that they won the majority of seats in the national election. Yeah. And what we find in our central estimate, regressing Awami League vote share on cyclone intensity, controlling for other factors, is that a 10% increase in storm intensity leads to a 2.5 percentage point increase in the Awami League vote share. So it's going from 74% in like a non-storm hit district to 77% in storm hit district. Right? So this is not so that already tells you this is not the entire story. Right? Everything else that came before it matters a lot.
Can I just make a point about the percentage. The percentage of votes cast, Awami League won of the total vote cast 38% of the vote, and Bhutto's People's Party won 18.9% of the vote cast. So it was just a issue of what system you followed, parliamentary, which was inherited from the British, or you would follow a party system. With a party system, it would not have a majority. It would have 38% of the vote and would have to be forced to make a position. But because of the parliamentary system where winner takes all, this is the result you have.
I see, but I mean, we all campaign and play by the rules that are in place, right?
Except that the Awami League did not allow, and the communist parties and left wing, they did not participate in the elections, and other United Pakistan parties were not allowed to campaign.
Okay. So second is a little bit surprising, which is that in places that were more devastated by the storm, the turnout is actually a little bit higher, not lower, right? So there seems to be, so that's in spite of the infrastructural challenges of participating in elections there. Right?
It may be an underestimate, right? So
It could be.
difference
Right?
you're saying.
Yeah, because already, I mean, those are the areas where it was much more difficult for people to actually cast their votes. And in spite of that, we'd be a higher vote share. Yeah. But yeah, I have no way to tell how much of an underestimate. Okay, so, and well, the other thing that you see, so basically what we put in, so we now look at 3 types of districts relative to non-intense storm districts, right? So in this effect of it going up by 2.5 percentage points, right? It's like in the areas that they did not receive relief, right? The effect is actually much larger. In the areas that they did receive relief, the effect is close to 0. Okay. But like why does that, but as you saw in the map, right? There's only a few districts that receive relief. So the 0 effect in those areas is not sufficient to overturn the aggregate effect of the storm. It's like heavily weighted towards the areas that did not receive relief, which was like 90% of the areas. Okay, and then the next data set we put together is that we code up the birthplaces of the insurgents who participated in the war in the list of freedom fighters, which is now published. And these are published actually, coincidentally, is related to the start of our July 2024 revolution, which is that the Awami League government was still providing a lot of, let's say, affirmative action like benefits, like holding quotas for the descendants of that list. Like now the grandchildren of those guys, and they were getting quotas of like 50% of all civil service jobs, right? So that's why the students took to the streets. Okay. So anyway, so we have that list of freedom fighters, so we know their birthplaces. So I can run the exact same regression, but putting the origins of the freedom fighters, that's on my left-hand side now. And what you find is that a 10% increase in storm intensity leads to like 1 more insurgent per district. So basically it's moving from 5 per district to 6 per district, and that's true of in that list. Okay. And then this was a surprising result. Okay. So now we look at the intellectuals were murdered in the major cities. That's where they were just like when they went to their houses and shot them, picked them up and shot them up. But we know their birthplaces, So they may physically not have been present, may or may not have been present in those districts, right? But of course, their families were, everybody is connected to, the district where you're from. And what you end up seeing is that for a 10% increase in storm intensity, there's a 25% increase in the probability of being targeted. Okay. Now, again, I promised you that, like, okay, so we do a whole bunch of robustness checks. It's like basically impossible to knock out that result up there. Right? This is the result, this last bit, where that's, I would say, is weakest. Right? It shows up in our main specification, but I can put in a set of controls in order to get rid of this. Right? But those two results are pretty strong. Okay. So let me summarize and stop here. Right? So basically, I'm going to repeat something I think I've already said, which is with this analysis, what we're trying to do is kind of give you a story for one particular important historical incident of how a climate event leads to people taking up arms and leads to conflict. Okay? And there was already pre-existing sentiments. Actually, we do those types of tests as well. So for example, we look at heterogeneity in these effect sizes as a function of the 1954 vote share for the United Front, which Awami League was a member of. And what you find is that the effect sizes are actually larger, where there was already pre-existing separatist sentiments in like 16 years prior. Okay. So there was already pre-existing movement towards more autonomy and independence, right? And this seemed to both accentuate it as well as sped it up, right? And ultimately led to the birth of a new nation. Okay? And that came from not just political participation in terms of voting, it also came from participation in taking part. That's the story. Yeah.
Does that last thing you mentioned suggest that this is more of a tipping point kind of model in the background rather than something where there are decreasing returns to persuasion? Seems like you're getting increasing returns, whereas already high, that's where there was even more.
Right.
And so.
All right, I love this question because it's a great segue to talking about my understanding of what happened in July of this year, of last year. Okay. So I'm going to indirectly answer your question.
Sounds great, whatever you want.
So, what we're calling the monsoon revolution that happened in July to get Sheikh Hasina, the daughter of Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. Okay. So, the protests. Okay, so I should give you a 10-year history. Actually, I can't just talk about July. It didn't happen in a vacuum. So, the Awami League and BNP were the two main political parties, right, that have engaged in really terrible, nasty, negative political competition, right? Where if you're in power, you became increasingly desperate to hold on to power, right? And if you're in power, then the other party will not honor or feel confident about the way that the election is being held, right? Because there are ways that you can interfere with the election, right? And so this kept happening, right, back and forth. So there was sort of cycling of power, but BNP just became so corrupt that our citizens, fellow citizens, got like sick of the BNP, and then finally, like there was a stalemate. They wouldn't relinquish power, even though in our constitution at that point there was a period of interim government, so that the interim government can take over and hold free and fair elections. Okay? So that wasn't happening. So finally, it got so bad, right? That, okay, so interim government takes power and then there's a free and fair election. And at that point, the BNP gets voted out. So this happened in 2008. And the Awami League did come to power in a free and fair election, and they had an overwhelming majority just because the BNP's activity leading up to 2008 was so bad. Okay? But then between 2008 and 2024, they become increasingly autocratic, right? It just gets worse and worse, right? Civil liberties are taken away, right? It gets bad. Just one anecdote, like there's a student somewhere in the Midwest, I think maybe at Ohio State, right? So nobody, like I observed this, nobody was willing to speak up anymore, right? Because people would disappear. Okay? People would get arrested by a new law called a Cybersecurity Act or something, right? Like based on their Facebook posts. Okay? And so then an Ohio State student, right, write something on Facebook about the lack of civil liberties, right? his mother in Bangladesh gets arrested. Okay. So this is how the Army League had shifted. Right? Now, and then it became really difficult for anybody to speak up. So because what happened was they were just taking people and they were disappearing. And then there was this new term like, oh, the person got caught in a crossfire and died. Right? Like some kind of crossfire, like there was some kind of gun fight happening, and then they just happened to die. Right? So this just became, more and more common. So people became more and more fearful, right? So the problem is that, like, if you say something, if you write in Facebook, right, you become a target. So then, and it was very effective because then everybody's afraid to say anything, right? And so in a situation like that, okay, what has to happen is there's just like among bait balls of fish, right? There is some protection in numbers, right? So what you need is a situation where everybody comes to the street all together, right? It doesn't matter what the cause is, right? But if there are thousands of people in the street as opposed to dozens, right? It becomes very difficult for you to disappear, right? And that's what happened. So this quota movement, there was a quota reform movement. The students went to the streets to complain about the fact that too many civil service jobs were being withheld for this affirmative action policy, right? This was sort of besides the point. Like if you asked me in June of 2024, tell me the 10 biggest problems in Bangladesh or the 20 biggest problems in Bangladesh, this quota reform movement the quotas would not be in my list, okay? But even though it was completely sort of irrelevant to the main issues, it got everybody on the street together, okay? And then a journalist did something really clever, right? Got our prime minister to say something about the fact that students were protesting and were cleverly worded the question so that she said something that really pissed off the students, okay? Which is basically she said something that made this, use the word Rajakar, which is a terrible word in Bangladesh. It means a collaborator with the Pakistan army, right, from 1971. Right? Because that's like they were the collaborators were like people who sort of
The traders.
yeah, the traitors, exactly. So she was calling them traitors, like, oh, so these students are complaining about the fact that we are holding our civil service job for freedom fighters. Are they the traitors? Something like that, right? Or are we supposed to hold it for the descendants of traitors? Okay. And so then this gets interpreted as she was calling these students traitors because they were complaining about the fact that unemployment rate is high, right? And so then they start a slogan in the streets that, who am I, traitor, traitor, who said it, dictator, dictator, right? And it just so happened that the word for dictator and the word for traitor also rhyme in Bangla. So that was helpful, right? And then the protests get bigger. Min, what are you doing here? Okay. I didn't realize you were here. He was my RA from pre-doc from a long time ago.
He's a postdoc here.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Good to see you. Good to see you. Okay, so then the protests get bigger, right? And then they let loose the government. Like, this is another really terrible aspect of Bangladeshi politics. Every political party has a student wing. Okay, so these are like career students who are students for decades, right? Who are basically, this is kind of like the internship period for getting into the party. Okay? And those guys control access to dorms, etc. I mean, the public university situation is really bad because unless you pay them off, you don't get a dorm room assignment, etc. Okay. So poor people coming from villages who need housing, right? You need to actually pay respects to them, right? So then they let loose these guys with their weapons, like equivalent of baseball bats, to go beat up on students, and it became, so now everything is documented. Everybody has a video camera in their hand, right? So then you see, like, this is in the Bangladeshi context, this is a problem where female students were being attacked by the student wing of the Army League. They call the Chhatra League instead of Army League. Chhatra League is student league. And then it gets bigger, etc. Okay, so why am I telling you the story in response? It's the fact that, it's a focal point that gets everybody together, right? Like that's safety in numbers.
That's what I'm pushing.
Yeah.
As an explanation for you.
Exactly. So that's what I kind of, I'm kind of retrofitting this based on what I saw in July of 2024.
So this is all very interesting. One of the things that if I saw the beginning of your presentation, with climate change, the intensity and frequency of storms are going to increase. And so, I'm just I'm just wondering if the predictive power of this model that, if you feed all the data that you can get from satellites and put it into some AI thing.
Predicting power of the climate model, you mean?
Yeah, the cycle.
The natural disasters.
For natural disasters.
Yeah.
Like here in this part of the world.
Yeah.
There's the conditions where if there's a storm, man, we can get a new state or something, something.
Okay. All right, good. So
Yeah.
I'm actually just independently, okay, this is great because this allows me to talk about what I normally do, which is not this kind of stuff. So I do research on climate change adaptation in coastal Bangladesh. Okay?
Yeah,
Where the
you're doing
model,
stuff with AI also, I don't know.
yeah, so where the, good. So let me tell you about like what our current state of knowledge. I'm going to say this in general terms, and most of this is coming from the fact that I have a bunch of co-authors at MIT who are climate scientists, right, who are running these models. Okay. So the models I'm talking about, by the way, like that predict higher frequency of disasters, they're not like global models of climate change, right? These are much more geography specific models, like for example, there's for the Bay of Bengal, there's a model, right? And those models are, a little, you can be a little bit more ambitious because, you don't have to hold the entire Earth constant. It's easier to hold some things constant, right? Locally. See what I mean?
Yeah.
Like think about a region fixed effect
Yeah,
econometric model as opposed to a cross-country regression.
Yeah, it's too chaotic.
Right. So that's where those predictions are coming from, right? Which is about natural disasters. And that's based on pretty solid science, right? So for example, even in the Caribbean, we are now seeing higher frequency of hurricanes, right? The hurricane season has expanded. I have a place in the Caribbean. So last year, we had the earliest hurricane, the second earliest in recorded history. There was a category 4 hurricane in June 24th of 2024. Okay.
Right.
And hurricane season normally starts in September. Right. Okay. So there's and why am I saying that the science is pretty it's on solid footing? It's because we do know that when there's warmer vapor, right, then there's like the collection of water vapor that just gets much bigger. Right? So I think we can be pretty confident about that part of it, which is a prediction about severity of the hurricane, right? And you actually see this this is already clear in contemporary data. Right? My insurance in my place in the Caribbean, it tripled in the last year, right? And that's because of it's the same market as Florida and all of the devastation that's happened in Florida. Okay, so that part I'm pretty on solid footing on. Okay? Where we're not at all on solid footing is all of the social science, which is how will people react to the hurricane, right? And that's a problem with all climate change research, where climate scientists, meteorologists, hydrophysicists, they model the movement of wind and water, and they do a pretty good job, right? As economists, when we've been trying to model how human beings might react to those changes in wind and water, that's where we know nothing. We say stupid things all the time, right? Like there's well-published economic studies that suggest, the effect of climate change is basically, I'm going to be careful because I'm now talking about complaining about some economic studies. So I'm not going to mention the paper or the authors.
I already know who they are.
But basically, the model result is that the cost of climate change can basically be approximated by the cost of migration, right? Because we just, there's say in agriculture, right? There's some places that are going to become too hot and the agricultural productivity will fall. The agricultural productivity in northern Canada and Siberia will increase, right? So what's the cost of climate change? That's going to be our adaptation. We just need to figure out how to move to the places that are going to be more productive, right? But underlying those models, right, is a presumption that somehow people from Congo will find themselves in Siberia. right? And there's probably a lot of social science there that we are kind of skipping over, right?
Right.
So that part, I think we're not at all on solid footing. So whether the second part of whether the climate change will lead to conflict by what mechanism, we have no idea.
Yeah.
The way you were discussing it, for this case at least, was that there has to be an underlying set of pretty severe grievances.
Yes,
And this is serving as a tipping point,
at the tipping point, yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so just because you have a climate shock, you have to look at what was the underlying context.
Right, right. Yeah, and my question, actually, I meant to, like, if you find a place that's prone to more climate change, and it also has these underlying, it's liable to manipulation, waiting for the shock, or, there can be all kinds of interesting.
Right. So I think if somebody, like, if there's a consulting firm or an insurance company, right,
Yeah.
that needs to do predictions, right? I really like what Lakshmi just said, which is, like, I think the predictions cannot solely be on the climate model.
Right.
I hope the consulting firm also takes into account, okay, let me understand the history of that place.
Absolutely.
Are there multiple groups? Are they easily identifiable? Are they ethnically different from each other? Are they almost similarly sort of powerful at baseline, right? As opposed to being very asymmetric power. Those things will probably help us predict better.
Right.
The other part is, of course, the leader reaction, right? In both the cases you were discussing,
Exactly,
this
yeah.
1970 and 2024,
Governance.
the leaders reacted very poorly.
Mhm.
So you can imagine better responses.
Absolutely. In fact,
These,
sometimes
tensions.
leaders get rewarded for cyclones when they react well, right? Because we learn something positive, right? I mean, and I think if you go back to Hurricane Katrina, yeah, and that was there we also learned something about the leader reaction, right?
So going back in history, just one last.
Yeah.
1582, and Bay of Bengal is prone to cyclones. It's historically documented. I think the first one is in Ain Akbari, 1582, 200,000 estimated people killed in that storm. My question is that all through history, we have seen these, maybe not as big as this one, but, and then El Nino, which goes against the Sen hypothesis that, El Nino caused the East African famines over years and South Asian, South Indian famines. So my question is that, going back in history, have you been able to find something similar in terms of popular unrest or
From
Bengal was a very important Mughal
cyclones.
1582.
Yeah, I mean, actually, we've had like by wind speed, even more major cyclones that have happened more recently in Bay of Bengal. So actually, that's what I know more about. Okay, so the more recent cyclones. So we had one in 1990. We had one actually in 2013. Okay. Now the 2013 cyclone Isla, right, was actually stronger in terms of the wind speed, was stronger than the Bhola cyclone. But what was different is that we had just a handful of deaths. Right?
Is that usual in cyclones?
So these days it is, right? So I think both in India and Bangladesh, right? Orissa, Odisha, and also gets hit by cyclone. West Bengal gets hit by cyclone. And what's become much more different, of course, some of it is, of course, infrastructure is better, right? We are better prepared. But what's much more different now is early warning systems.
Early warning and building of things like shelters.
Shelters
right?
for, yeah.
So you get the early warning, but what do you do with the warning before?
Yeah.
Then people are.
So livestock still die, right? But livestock still die, but humans don't die nearly as often. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. Was really fascinating. I have two questions about confounding that are very, I think, closely related in relation to the results. One is the effects of the cyclone clearly are stronger in the southern part, closer to the coast, right? And so I could potentially imagine many reasons why people in that particular region would be more likely.
That's essentially right. So the results, especially the first two results here, they hold if you exclude coastal.
So I wanted to ask you about how do you control for that, for potential geographic effects, but also more substantively, if there is any potential for people in the south to go differently, what would be the reasons for that? And then in relation to the results for victims and fighters, my question was what was the initial distribution of the population? So you could imagine that you would find those results simply as a result of demographics. If you have more people in the south,
Oh, I see.
you may have more, simply
Okay.
higher density of
All right.
fighters.
I'm gonna forget, so let me go to the first one first, right? There's several checks you can do on the coastal story. Okay. So one is you could just look at non-coast areas and use the variation in intensity between places that are were more intensely hit versus less intensely hit, right? Which can be north and south, and you might have a concern about that as well, because that maybe the further north you go, political preferences are different. Right? But the other test you can do is going in the other direction, longitude rather than latitude, okay? Which is there are coastal areas that got hit and coastal areas that did not, right? Because so Bangladesh has so imagine the coast is like this, right? The cyclone hits this side, the southeast part of the country, not the southwest. Okay. So you can do that check as well. So within the set of coastal areas, is there more of an effect on the southeast rather than southwest? Again, the same result. Okay. And then the final, and that got me thinking, and this helps answer your second question about, okay, what's different about coastal areas? So it turns out the southwest part especially, right? That's a big belt of Hindu population. Okay. And remember that the reason for Pakistan's formation was Islam. Right? And so you would expect the Hindu population to be, generally speaking, more Awami League, pro-Awami League all throughout, right? So then, like one of the important controls that you want to have in there, which we do, is share of the Hindu population district by district, right? And then the final test that we do is that you can do placebo checks, okay? Which is, let's imagine, this is more about the cyclone, maybe it's not so directly related to what you're saying, but imagine like looking at that same satellite image like a week before, right? And I can construct a measure of from that, like variation in that, what that satellite image is showing me in terms of radiation, right? And a week before, like when I look at correlate that with voting, I don't see the same pattern, right? So basically, yeah, but the general point here is that this is cross-sectional correlation because we're studying a historical episode here, right? So therefore, we have to be careful about alternative stories, and you just came up with good ones, right? And we do our best to check for those alternatives.
How about the demographic? So
in terms of the
fighters and the
fighters, yeah. So those are actually we're reporting everything in terms of shares of population, right? Shares of but I can't remember if we do share of like a particular age group, like that. Maybe that's what we should do. So which is like essentially what I'm saying is when I say share, what I mean is like redefining my left-hand side variable of participation in the war, like the fighters, right? As a function of how many 15 to 50-year-olds there are. Yeah, I can do that. Yeah.
Maybe just a comment and then a question. So 1991, you had the transition from Ershad to actually what was an interim government. Then you had this big hurricane, and the interim government had to handle that. Just
excellent knowledge in Bangladesh.
He lived in Bangladesh for many years.
Oh, okay.
And at that time, that cyclone was hit, and there was no warning at all.
Yeah.
So they lost 250,000 people and scores of cattle. But
there was not this big unrest, right?
No, the interesting thing was this transition government, which had just taken over, which really had consolidated, actually managed it reasonably well. Yeah. But part of what was going on, and this is where I wanted to sort of ask a little bit about, what helped there was you had a very active civil society response on the coast. All the shelters that got built were, Ramin was involved, BRAC was involved, and a whole bunch of other organizations. Yeah. And so I want to sort of fast forward to 2024. So there was a lot of campus activity going on from 91 to 2024, and the Chhatra League would always put it down. But when this one happened in 2024, you had all these new private universities.
Yes.
And the riot occurred first, and the Chhatra League put it down, and then the private universities came in force. Yeah. And then the streets just were out of control. Yeah. So I think there's a really interesting story there about the growth of civil society, independent institutions, and actually the state lost control of the campuses.
Wonderful. You can actually not just fast forward, you could rewind, right? And the foundation of BRAC BRAC was founded
By
in
Candy Rodi and Marty Chen.
and yeah, well, by Abid,
And Abid.
but they were they were friends at the time.
Right.
Yeah, Marty and Candy were good friends with Abid, and in fact, when they were organizing their relief efforts, so Abid had an office in Chittagong because he worked for this like accounting firm.
Oil company.
Oil company, good. He was an accountant, but for an oil company, so they worked out of his apartment that the oil company gave him his flat. So then, the formation of those important civil society organizations like BRAC was a direct response to the 1970 cyclone.
Right.
It was originally so your story, I think, tracks even going backwards. And absolutely, what you just mentioned about private universities was extremely important, right? Because there was so the reason I got involved in all of this is because I've been, I do a lot of research in Bangladesh. I hire lots of Dhaka University students, right? And those are the people who I was in constant contact with, like basically WhatsApp contact with in mid-July, right? And those students, there are many Dhaka, so public university students, and they themselves will tell you that if the private university students didn't come and join the movement, like about a week later, this movement would have died out.
Yeah.
This would not have continued, right? And what's important for everybody else, right, is that the private university student population represents a very different socioeconomic demographic, right, than the public universities, right? They come from, so we're now talking about middle-class families in Dhaka, right? So the parents who are sort of part of that civil society, professional in Dhaka, their children were in the street, right? And that changes things in a fundamental way than if only the children of rural folks are in the street.
Yeah, these are the children of the garment factory owners.
Yeah.
So their businesses were affected also. So it shifted. So can you say, I mean, just maybe, could you say a little bit about what's going on now? Because there's this whole prospect of the student movement creating a party. And the BNP trying to sort of cut that off.
They are trying.
What's the path forward for Bangladesh? Now, it's a transition government, but what are they transitioning?
So in terms of like there's no clear answers here. So anything I tell you is going to be my opinion, which may prove to be wrong, right? But in terms of how long this interim government will stay in power, right? The general agreement seems to be about 18 months from, say, September of 2024, right? And then like sometime around 18-month mark is when we should have election. Okay? And the BNP has been patient, right? It's not like they're trying to force an election much earlier than that, right? And they recognize that, look, they weren't able to, like what the students did, right? Like toppling a government. Like BNP had many years of chances and efforts to do it. They didn't get anywhere close to what the students said. Ultimately did, like the power here should reside with students. So what the students did that was really smart is that the day after Hasina flees to India, right? So they were being sidelined immediately because the army chief called a meeting and called the leaders of BNP, Jamaat, etc., the various political parties, and the students didn't have a seat at the table. So then they go on Facebook, like Facebook Live, right? And the 5-6 identified student leaders, right? And one of them who had been tortured, and so he had established credibility. They say, we want Dr. Yunus as our leader, right? And that was a really clever move because he had sort of international name recognition, right? So like, whereas students like, why should I take you seriously? Okay, you did your job of being in the streets, right? Well, why should you have a seat at the table now? Because now it's the grown-ups who should be talking about how the country is governed, right? But by bringing in Dr. Yunus immediately, right? They became relevant again, right? Because he was the face that was important. Okay, so now the students, so I've now met with some, like one of them came to the, some of them traveled with Dr. Yunus for the UN General Assembly meetings towards the end of last year, right? And so they are actively trying to enter politics, right? Now, but then there's some of them, like important student leaders, like one of them, I had her come and speak at Yale. So she's getting a PhD in cellular and molecular biology in like Florida State. Okay, because that's her path to success, right? right? Even though she was a very good organizer, right? But she understands that, like, you know, partly also because of gender issues in the country, she also realizes that it's not going to be easy for her to become a political leader, right? Because the other issue that you see even among students is that it's very, very gendered now, right?
You have to have your dad murdered before you can become a female.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, or you have to be not just the daughter of, or the wife of.
Or the wife.
Yeah. So, so the students are trying, I would say the male students are trying to form a party, right? But the thing about politics in Bangladesh is that it's also, politics is kind of played and fought in the streets everywhere, right? And so the students would have to put up that infrastructure all over the country, right? And so one issue that we have immediately after the revolution is that the student presence was great in cities because that's where universities are, right? But it's not so great in most of the country, right? And that's why, you know, immediately after, right, when there were attacks, right, like a breakdown of law and order, right, the students took it upon themselves to like protect temples, and right, but they could do that much better where they lived near cities, but they weren't able to protect, you know, the law and order situation from devolving into chaos in other parts of the country. And so the other thing I should be clear in saying is that, you know, the country is in flux. It's not clear, you know, I think the interim government has also screwed up in a lot of ways, right? A lot of business owners still don't feel comfortable and confident that their property rights are going to be protected, right? But it's also the case that the Army League stole billions, right? And so we need to get macroeconomic stability as well, right? And so it's important for our central bank governor to keep investors confident that they will get paid back. And so that's in the works. So there's a lot of uncertainty, like things, you know, but where are they screwing up? Where I think Dr. Yunus, you know, he's run an NGO successfully. That's very different from running a country with 175 million people, right? And so he hasn't been, you know, perfect in terms of like just governance, right? Oh, are we being recorded? Yes. Okay. Yeah, so there's like places where, you know, you really need to pay attention to, you know, what business owners need, right? That includes the garment factory owners, but it includes other types of businesses too, right? And they feel like they're like, you know, like if they're not happy at the moment, right? And if they feel like, look, of course, we had our civil liberties taken away, but at least we had our business and we were making money, right? Like if the tide turned in that direction, then maybe we were better off, even though we didn't have any freedom, right? That could be a dangerous place for the country. Right? And India somehow has retained its support. Like they bet on the wrong horse. This person turned out to be a dictator, but I don't understand why India has continued supporting them, right? It seems like that some of it is internal Indian politics, right? Which is if you can characterize what happened in Bangladesh as, oh, the students were just a front, this was just an Islamist revolution, Bangladesh is becoming like Afghanistan, that is valuable for the BJP.
Didn't she also blame America?
Yeah, she actually, yeah, it was fantastic. So basically, so the Indian media.
Serious.
Oh, absolutely. I'm also being serious. It was just like so amazingly weird. Okay, so the Indian media, like even after all this happens, the only person that they put on in front of cameras is her useless son who lives in Virginia, right? And looks like a drunk at the time, and I don't care that I'm being recorded. And he actually went to the same school I did in Tamil Nadu.
No.
So it's all your fault. So you know, so they kept giving him the microphone, right? And then the media asked him, "Oh, so tell us, how did America engineer all of this?" Right? And then he says, you know, and then the interviewer keeps saying, "Oh, so China and the US must have been behind this, right?" Okay. So then he's like, "Oh, no, I don't think China has any interest in this, but yes, America might have done this, etc." Right? And then the interview goes back, "Oh, so tell us about China's role." You know, it's so weird. And they were just like, it was like, "Oh, let me just throw something at the wall, let me see what sticks." So one issue, I mean, this is the, like, maybe the final thing I'll say, because we're out of time, is like the Indian media's role, right, has not been very helpful or constructive at all, right? And it's been a destabilizing force, right? I don't think the situation is far from perfect in Bangladesh, right? So what happens is, as soon as there's a breakdown in law and order, people try to take advantage of it, and often minorities are going to be the easiest target, right? But the way that this gets framed as, oh, this was all about an Islamist revolution, that couldn't be. I mean, I was in touch with the students who were in the streets. They did this. This wasn't a front for anything else. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. We're delighted to welcome you, and once again to thank the Kellogg Institute. Daniel, thank you so much for your support and for you and all the staff. We look forward to the following lectures that will take place during this semester. We have 4 other speakers coming, so we would be delighted to have you join us as well.
It's gonna be hard to beat.